So lately, when you go online or even when you talk to your friends, something feels off. The world seems to have become more hostile. Discussions turn to fights quicker, and it seems like everyone is only fighting for themselves. Empathy is a word thrown around all the time at the moment, and especially that we are lacking it. But are we? And what is empathy actually? In this video, I'm going to explore empathy and the question if it's a skill that we will see less and less in people, the consequences of it, and how we can make sure that we ourselves are a good influence on people. Empathy is divided in 3 different segments. One is the cognitive empathy, one is the emotional empathy, and one is the compassionate empathy. The cognitive empathy is what makes us understand why someone feels the way they do. And it is an important skill as it helps us to decide how to treat people around us, because then we understand what effect it has on people. The emotional empathy is what makes us feel what others feel. We mirror the emotions of a person close to us, and it helps us to understand what a person is going through by experiencing it ourselves. Emotional empathy helps us to relate and to form close bonds. And in Germany, we have this nice saying that shared pain means everyone is only feeling half the pain. The compassionate empathy is what makes us want to fix what's wrong. It is what gives us the drive to help and jump into action. Sometimes we will meet people who are more of a listener or who even cry with us when we cry. And then we will meet people who want to immediately solve what's wrong. That's because empathy in itself is a spectrum. And those 3 segments that I talked about are developed differently for every human being. Some it's because of genetics, some it's because how we are raised and what we have experienced in life. And sometimes it's because everything around us shapes our empathy skills. And of course, some depends on how our brain is wired. And I will talk about this a little bit later. If we're lacking skills or skills are disrupted in specific areas, that can cause medical defined disorders. For example, people with antisocial personality disorder, and in particular those who we would identify as having psychopathic traits, they know what will make a person a certain way. But they do lack the emotional empathy and the compassionate empathy, which means they know what they are doing to you by doing the thing, but they just don't care. And I say this completely judgmental free because it is a condition. While there is a certain amount of conscious decision making to it, a lot has to do with how the brain is working or is not working. In ADHD and autism, there can be a disruption in how the emotional empathy is perceived. And don't misunderstand me, that doesn't mean that people with autism and ADHD do not have empathy. This is how the general public often describes it, but it's about how it is experienced and processed. People with autism and who have ADHD will often try to cope this gap of the not proper working emotional empathy by extending their cognitive empathy. And I can give an example how that works. When they listen to someone's problem, then they will reply with a situation where they had something similar happening to them. And this is an attempt to form a bond through the cognitive empathy by mirroring the experience and saying, hey, I understand you. I know what you're going through because this happened to me. Unfortunately, this often will lead to misunderstandings because when people don't have autism or ADHD, this behavior is seen as being self-centered or as someone trying to hijack someone else's problems. But in reality, it's just a very creative way to overcome the shortcomings of the emotional empathy by replacing the strategies. And one thing that's even more interesting, it's not something that the person will consciously decide to do, but autistic people and people with ADHD all over the world have shown to do this to relate to other people. It actually seems to be a fallback default solution for the brain. Talking about the brain, what is actually happening in our brain? How does empathy work? In our brain, we have cells that are mirror neurons. They react when we experiencing something emotional ourselves, but they react the same way when we witness it. And they are one of the key parts in our brain that makes us feel empathy. Science thinks that there is a genetic component that is connected on how capable these neurons are. So they did studies and they found out that people with antisocial personality disorder, like I said earlier, people who identified as having psychopathic traits, they will have an overstimulation in the part of the brain that is responsible for the cognitive empathy. So understanding how people are feeling, and even having heightened senses on recognizing those emotions. But the activity is much, much lower in the part of the brain with the mirror neurons, the part that makes us feel the emotions. They don't have necessarily less mirror neurons, they just don't work as well as they should. And this is of course an oversimplification, but it shows what happens in our brain and what happens if our brain doesn't work the way it is intended to. But aside from brain architecture, our environment is also important. When we are little children, we already learn empathy when we have a protected home, social interaction with other people, and, very important, safe conflicts with other children, while having understanding parents will help us to train the 3 segments of our empathy. For example, our parents will explain to us why people feel the way they do. And the safe environment we're in makes us feel safe to be vulnerable, to experience those emotions and not be judged. And the contact with other children will help us to be compassionate because we want others around us to feel good as well, because that makes us feel good. These are the ideal conditions, and we all know when looking back to our childhood that these are not always met. But fear not, that's not the end of it, because our learning is of course not limited to our childhood. It provides the foundation for our abilities, but we ourselves, we can progress through life and learn all day, every day. Every new challenge, every new memory, every new experience will help us make our mind up about how we deal with people around us, and that will shape our values and our ethical systems and our empathy. For example, cognitive empathy gets trained by analyzing conflicts and opinions of other people. We will always reflect other people's emotions and other people's opinions about things to make up our mind. And the emotional empathy can be trained through the consumption of media, books or movies, and music to an extent as well. And the compassionate empathy will especially be trained with family. And if you later have children, to be part of the family, this is for many people the point where they face their own compassionate empathy and maybe the lack of. Science says that empathy in itself is a skill that is needed for parenting, because when you're having a baby that cannot directly communicate with you what's wrong and what it wants, it is crucial to be able to empathize and then to be compassionate and wanting to help the baby. Understanding without direct communication and the problem solving to have the baby be happy are probably the most important skills as parents early on. But that's not where it stops, because later empathy is still important as our society has grown larger and larger. Our idea of small tribes in which we interact with each other is already past. Like, our society is way too big for that, which means in order to survive, we became dependent on other people and we need to cooperate with them. And problem solving is a group skill and is a team skill, and therefore it is required to survive. But right now, people say that we see a regression in empathy. And why is that? First, we should have a look at empathy and how it is not only an exclusive positive skill. Because while we know a lot about empathy, there is still the question open if our empathy skills can weaken over time, or if they just focus differently, and instead of being presented as a general empathy that we have towards everyone, they just focus on specific groups. And I think a little bit of both is probably part of the truth. We have a big problem, and that is that our society these days lives off engagement and attention. And many ways to get this attention have led to, let's say, advertisers or media creators to learn about human psychology and to analyze what is the most effective way of getting our attention. And talking to the emotional part of people's brains is the most preferred and the most successful way to gain people's empathy and loyalty. Companies trick your brain into bonding with a celebrity, product, or brand. The brain gets tricked into standing up for someone or standing up for a brand that doesn't know you and probably doesn't even care about you. And this is a manipulation technique that has been going on online since social media became an advertising industry at first and a communication hub for people at last. And the more the people are exposed to this attention grabbing and this empathy grabbing, the more likely they will experiencing something that is called empathic distress fatigue. This is something that beforehand was only seen in social worker or therapist who had to listen to people's life stories every day and who had problems processing this in a good and timely manner. Because if everyone around you screams how much you are supposed to care about things, the less you do. it's just too overwhelming for your brain. You are then at the point where helping doesn't feel fulfilling or rewarding anymore, and it just simply feels like you're not doing enough. Your brain will come to the conclusion, what difference would it make if you simply don't help at all? Because if it doesn't feel fulfilling, what's the motivation? One thing we can't and shouldn't forget, even though I mentioned brands and companies, is politics. Politics have become a spectacle that uses marketing tricks to get votes. It's not so much about what a political party or a politician stands for, but about the sympathy they can gather. It has become a common trend that people don't even know the political goals of the candidates they vote for. Electoral campaigns are long and discuss people's livelihoods, but they also create a very competitive environment that usually does not foster general empathy for all people. Instead, they foster empathy for a certain group, the group oneself belongs to. In opposition to that, the others are seen as threatening the livelihood of one's own people, and this is how electoral campaigns work at their core. This is where empathy is misguided and instrumentalized. After elections, and sometimes even before the election itself, people experienced fatigue and don't even go voting, as they all just want it to be over. And then everyone is on their own, everyone has to fight for themselves, and it's just survival of the fittest in its rawest and purest form. And this shapes and changes our society. Scientists think that this is a chain effect that is happening right now. When people who experience empathetic distress fatigue raise children, these will not be trained in the skills of empathy. So they will already lack empathy when growing up. And when they will raise children again, they will again raise children with a lack of empathy. And the big problem is right now our society is rewarding this behavior. Let's say we look at politics in the world. Right now we see that egocentrism, which is like the I come first mindset, is presented by many people in the spotlight and who are in the position of decision making. So empathy as a skill in itself might not be regressing, but it might be misdirected. And the people around you are just played like a chess piece to the point where they experience empathetic distress fatigue and completely block themselves off from experiencing empathy. But now we run into a problem because empathy is not just a nice to have. Empathy is the most important way for us to build connections to other people. And the lack of empathy or the inability of feeling and acting through empathic motivation will make us lonely. We will be unable to make friends. You hear people say all the time, past the age of 30, it's almost impossible to make friends. And why is that the case? It's because we need to invest emotions and our empathy in order to bond with people. And loneliness has been declared as an epidemic that many people already fell victim to. Since the 90s, the percentage of people's loneliness has skyrocketed. And while there are of course many other factors that will play into this, the lack of meaningful connections to others and our inability to let people be part of our lives and communicate on a deep level, and this is everything that requires empathy, that's just fueling the fire that causes us to be alone and lonely. And while the internet would have been an amazing tool to connect us with the people that match with us, it has more and more become the tool that farmed us for our need to build those connections, and that is now responsible for our fatigue and our inability to do so. And while this all sounds very bleak, there are ways to turn this around. There are several ways to train our empathy and to make us more compassionate around other people. And the most important thing is to be selective who we show our empathy to. Since it is such a strong way to bond with someone or something, it is often misused by companies. So we need to look and we need to differentiate. Do the people's words and actions align that we show our empathy to? Do those people risk something in order to help others? Or are they just talking nicely? We need to limit who we give our empathy to preserve our cognitive energy. And we of course need ourselves to be mindful about our own position and opinion of other people's lives. We need to understand that our life is not the default. We need to put ourselves into someone else's shoes to understand what they are going through. And we need to have the general wish to improve someone else's life over making it worse. It sounds like common sense, but believe me, it is not. And it is the best motivator to become more empathetic and more compassionate. Our positions and opinions are never the only way life can be lived and experienced. And once we understand this, it makes it so much easier to understand other people. Another thing we can do is consume media, like books, watching movies, especially those that do not match our own experience and challenges us in our beliefs and viewpoints, because that provides a safe method for us to train empathy without real-life consequences or interpersonal conflicts. Another amazing way to train our empathy are, for example, tabletop RPGs. If you heard about it, Dungeons and Dragons, but there are also other systems. And they have grown in popularity over the last years. You are playing a character that most likely has a different life and a different life experience than you have. And the tabletop RPG in itself is a safe and controlled environment. The things you experienced as the fake persona will still feel real to you and real enough that you care about this persona, about your character. The funny thing is, our brain doesn't understand the difference between real and played. So everything that you will experience during the play, let's say the bonding with your player friends, the adventures you experience, the problem solving you do, the lessons you learn, they feel real enough that it shapes your brain. As you can see, there's a lot we can do to become more empathetic and to stay empathetic and to make an impact in each other's lives. It will require a little bit work to spot those who want to dry our empathy. But once we understand the system and once we understand the patterns, we can make meaningful connections that will last our whole life. So the question is not really if we are not empathetic anymore, but the question is what we do to train our empathy skills and to preserve our cognitive energy for people around us, instead of brands and celebrities. Everyone can start small and make a big impact, and you should actually start today. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. And if this is the kind of video you like to watch, please consider subscribing, as this is the kind of content I want to put more focus on in the future. And if you want to support me in my research and content making, I now have a Patreon. Check the link in the description. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.